I know, for a lot of people, when I say things like, I'm happy to be here to talk about grief, that might sound a little bit strange, but I really am because, I learned, as most people do, I come to grief work from my own experience. And I really learned with my most recent loss, especially, that I didn't know enough about grief. People who wanted to support me didn't know enough about grief. And my workplace for sure didn't know enough about grief to be able to support me the way that I needed. So I most recently, my most recent loss is that of my son, Ben. He was 22 and he died in September of 2020. So we're just coming up on the 3rd-year anniversary. And as you might expect, the loss of a child, that out of order loss, really just is something that I never had really contemplated. I never had really thought how different that might be. I had lost my dad when I was in my 30s. My mom died when I was in my 40s. And I really hadn't thought about how different it would be with the loss of a child. What that did for me, and seems to do for most parents who have experienced the death of a child, is it's just grief on a level that we just haven't really been able to contemplate. And that was the case for me. I realized very early I didn't have enough knowledge about grief. So when the very normal, typical symptoms started to happen to me, I thought there was something wrong with me. We have this strange silence around grief as a collective, as a culture. And so we're not learning from each other. So no one who had experienced deep grief before me said at the time, oh my gosh, I'm having intense brain fog, or I'm really struggling to feed myself, or my sleep pattern is all messed up, or I have muscle pain, or, any of those very normal symptoms that happen to us. But because we don't talk about it and we don't share about it, we don't know what's coming. So as I got through sort of those early survival days, and, if you're listening to this, I know we're making a recording that Barbara's going to be able to share, if you're listening to this and you feel like you're really in those early days, the curiosity I held in those days literally was about, how do I breathe? Right. And our rule for my daughter and I was that we were going to do one hard thing. That was it. That's all the capacity we had. Because when someone has passed away, you have to do lots of hard things. We would do one a day, and then our whole to-do list was just to breathe. So really, that was the curiosity. How do I breathe when I'm curled up in a ball on a couch, sobbing so hard that I can't gasp a breath? Right? How do I just get through a day? How do I feed myself? How do I do anything? Right? Everything becomes a question. So that early curiosity was about that, about just surviving. And then my curiosity really became about that common understanding among grievers that grief will change your address book. That's certainly what I experienced. And I was fascinated by why that just was accepted. And what I was curious about was why that happened. So I really dove deeply into books and podcasts and experts and, any forum I could find where people were talking about grief, to try and start to figure out why that was. I went on to do my grief educator certification with David Kessler because I knew I also wanted a foundation in training in knowledge beyond just my own experience. And I really wanted to understand if what I had experienced was unique or different or fairly normal. And the reality is that, grief is a universal experience. We're all going to experience it. And every time we do, it's going to be different. And there are some common things we might expect along the way. I think because we don't talk about it, we carry a lot of fear. So when I do a workshop and I ask people, why they didn't show up the way they wish they had for someone, because usually that's why they're in the room, right? And that may be why some of you are in the room. You're in a position at work where you have some influence, or you have colleagues you care about, or people you supervise, and you think, oh, I don't have a really great skill level here. Inevitably, the answer of why they didn't show up the way they wish they had, about 97% of the time, it's because of fear. So I got really curious about what created that fear. And fear, of course, comes for a lot of things from a lack of knowing. So how could I use my experience, my knowledge, my research, all my reading to help people understand how grief really works and to open up those conversations? So my mission kind of became, if my end game is normalizing grief, I would love for it to be as normal to talk about our griefs and losses as it is what we binge watched on the weekend, right? It's just a normal part of our life. We talk about it openly. We share our experiences. We have people in our lives who have expertise, hard earned usually, and we can go to them when we need to. We have all those kinds of conversations around all other things in our lives, many of them, but we don't around grief. So how could I shift that culture? How could I shift that paradigm for us as a collective? Where's that tipping point, right? How do we get that to be something we talk about more naturally? And one of the things I realized is a lot of the time when we're trying to make big cultural shifts, so if we think about things like diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, if we think about things like anti-sexual harassment training, for example, we do a lot of that training in the workplace because we're trying to shift a culture. And in the workplace, we already have shared agreements, right? Spoken or unspoken. We have some shared agreements about how we operate. We have a community. It may be really dysfunctional, right? I've worked in a lot of places where we just aimed to keep the fun and dysfunctional, but we did really care about each other. And so looking at how it shows up in the workplace gives us a place where we can really create a huge difference for employees and team members. And also, ultimately, if you're in a for-profit or not-for-profit business, the bottom line is important. We need money to be able to do our programs. We need money to be able to have team members and, support them in ways that we want to. The last really robust study in North America was the Grief Index that was done in 2003. And they calculated the cost of hidden grief at just over $70 billion a year. 71.6 or something like that, just over 70 billion. That's in the US annually in 2003. So when you adjust that for inflation, it bumps it up to about 125 billion. And we need to remember too, the experience we've all gone through in the last 3.5 years, we are swimming in a sea of grief. There's so much loss we've experienced of loved ones, of experiences, of our sense of normalcy, right? So I'm sure that number is a wild underestimate, but it's pretty staggering just as it is. And I think that we really need to be taking good care of, our team members, the people we want to retain, that we want to feel engaged, and our bottom line. And we can do both of those things if we can build some grief resilience. So that's where I've decided to focus. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm just going to start sharing the screen so that you can see the slides. And it's doing something weird, but give me 1 second and we'll pull it up here. Let me just get to the correct slide, which I had all set up before. There we go. Make it a slideshow and it'll be so much prettier. There we go. You should now see the pretty slideshow. Yes? Okay, fabulous. Thanks, Barbara. So grief at work, one of our aims, right, especially in this market where there's a global staffing shortage, many businesses are looking at that employer of choice status. So how do we look at grief resilience and link it to all the things that matter for us as an employer? So we're linking it to engagement, we're linking it to retention, and ultimately to the bottom line. So one of the things we need to do when we're talking around grief is make sure that we have a shared understanding of the language that we're using. So before I define grief resilience, I would love for you to define grief resilience for yourself. So when you see that term, when you think of what that might mean, you can either pop it in the chat if you're a happy typist, or if you want to just unmute yourself and share verbally, pop on camera, all of that is great, just so that we're starting to share a little bit about where we're at. And we're really looking at, how do we all bring our expertise to the table and create this shared understanding? And I want to presence too, just as we get started, I'll share my story, I'll share experiences from other grievers. And I know talking about grief sometimes can be activating. So this is a safe space, right? We're practicing together. How do we create safe spaces around grief and conversations around grief? One of the ways that we do that is to just give people permission to have all of the emotions that come up at any given moment, to do some breathing, whatever you do to self-regulate. Tapping is fabulous. You can do it on your fingertips under the table in meetings. No one ever knows you're doing it. You can, do some breathing, whatever you need to do. And certainly you're welcome to stay off camera, come on camera, share or not share, but just really think of this as a safe place. I was doing a version of this workshop a few days ago, and I looked at the calendar because I was talking about the anniversary of Ben's death coming up, and it was 10 days from that day. And so of course my eyes welled up because that's how grief works, right? But we can grieve and be productive. We can grieve and give a workshop. So just think of this as a really safe space for whatever comes up, for you to, get yourself back into self-regulation. Whatever tools you have in your toolbox, feel free to pull them out. And define grief resilience for me.
I would like to go first.
Awesome. Go ahead.
For me, it means to be able to overcome grief in a very fast and quick way. To just accept. It's more quickly accepting the situation versus being in the bargaining stage, and all that, going through all those stages. So being resilient means just accept and then move forward, not move on, but move forward. When I'm teaching, when I have a client that's going through grief, I always tell them, you don't move on, you move forward, because moving on mean you've forgotten about the individual and all that stuff, but moving forward, like you're progressing forward while you still hold your dear person in your heart. Because I lost both of my parents and I went through those stages. And then I just decided I didn't go to therapy. I healed myself. How I did it, I have no idea. But I was able to overcome it. And then I realized that, wait a second, Muta, you're very resilient. You just went through this without no therapy. Okay. But not everybody is able to have that kind of strength and acceptance to be able to come to acceptance, because I can't change it. But what I could do is hold them in my heart. That's what I meant by grief resilience, to be able to accept quickly and then move forward rather than sitting in that depressive state and then having emotional regulation.
And I love that idea of moving forward, right? That languaging is so important. And I think when we talk about moving on, it kind of has that implication that we're leaving our person behind us somewhere. So I say I'm moving with, right? I'm moving with them. I'm moving with my mom and dad. I'm moving with all the other loved ones that are no longer here walking with me. But yeah, I love that idea. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Nora.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be part of this today. I also lost, and I'm sorry for everyone who loses somebody. I used to love my husband for 17 years, but he's not dead. He cheated on me and he left me. And it was too hard for me because I was so dependent on that person. Anyway, the most important part, I think, is to get into the stages and be in a way that you're aware what stage of grief you are at. The second is to accept and think about the present moment. So the idea of you can't change what happened, don't regret, don't be mad, don't be sad, accept and think about what I can do now, not even next. What are the facilities now? How can I manage what I have? How can I manage my resources? How can I make myself happy as if now it's my last moment of life? So how can I do it? And how can I enjoy it? How can I really make everyone in front of me happy? Because this is also something, like sometimes because of grief, we merge ourselves, we sink into the sadness and like being sad and crying and all of that, and forget about that we have another beloved people who are waiting for us, like our kids or any other family members. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you've helped us broaden our sense of the definition of grief itself, right? We're pretty good at understanding grief should come when a loved one has died, but you're experiencing grief from the loss of the relationship, right? The loss of what you thought it was, the loss of what you thought he was, right? So many other losses. And I think that's a really important distinction for us to make, that grief comes from all kinds of losses. Some griefs will be bigger than others. will take us longer to navigate, will be more life disrupting than others, but grief comes from every kind of loss, and, you know, big ones and small ones. So we'll talk about that more, but I really appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Thank you so much for sharing. Diana, go ahead.
Hi. My grief has been family members, and it's hard. But when I was studying grief in school and the process of grief, I actually encourage people to grieve in their own way, and that there's no guideline. These are the process you have to go through, but don't let, because I was told not to do this and not to do that. And I really believe that people have to do what they need to do. And I heard on a podcast that that a woman said, instead of saying, you know, I'm sorry, you can say to the person, what do you need? What do you need me to do for you right now? Do you need me to cook a couple of meals? Do you need me to take you to an appointment? Ask them what they need now. And that takes the burden off of everybody, instead of guessing, or the person trying to think, well, what do I need now? Because during grieving, we don't know. As you said, you just got through the day by breathing.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's kind of what I feel. And now with my loved ones that have been gone for a lot of years, I choose to include them in my thoughts. If something reminds me of my sister Wendy, I'll say, oh, Wendy would love that, as if she's still here with me. In a sense, like, I don't pretend, oh, I'm so sad, because it doesn't make me sad anymore. It makes me, oh, she would love that, or something I've accomplished, she would be proud of me. Things like that. So I include them in my life. My best friend, I include her in my life. I talk to them. That's what helps me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that's that sense of moving forward with the person, right? For me, the goal around processing our grief, dealing with our grief, getting through, however you want to articulate it for yourself, the goal is integration. So that's that idea that you can think of the person with more love than pain. And that's what you're experiencing, right? And how you're doing it, Diana, right? Is that sense that, yeah, you can see something and think, oh, Wendy would think that was so funny, or I'll see something and usually, frankly, think, oh, Ben would think that was so ridiculous, because he probably would have. But it is that
Right.
sense that, you know, we carry those people with us, and we still look at things and remember them. And when we can get to the place where we can do that with more love than fear, or more love than pain, then, you know, we can feel a bit more ease around the whole grieving experience and journey. So when I think about grief resilience,
exactly it.
Yeah, when I think about grief resilience, it's exactly the kinds of things you've named. So really opening up our sense that grief is a normal and natural reaction to all kinds of losses, big, small, you know, loved ones, experiences, jobs, businesses, all of those. And even sometimes a change for the better will have loss attached and will bring some grief. It's that both and. So much of the time with grief, it's that both and, right? And resilience for me, I don't mean in a sort of cheerleading way where you like quickly get back to what you were before. Because I know for me, you know, the person who existed before Ben died doesn't exist anymore. So my resilience was about, as many of you had said, that sense of, you know, what can I do now? This is my reality. So if I can accept that this is my reality, and at times my reality is horrible, what can I still do? How do I move these emotions? How do I allow myself to feel them all? How do I be, you know, very aware that I don't want to stuff them all, because we know that's bad for us, right? So that sense of resilience being about, yes, rebuilding, but rebuilding with some intentionality, rebuilding with a goal of really integrating our losses into our lives so we're moving forward with. So you're all, you know, in the A+ class. That's awesome. What we're going to do now is create a matrix so you can identify, so I have a bit of a cold today, so my voice may come and go. You can identify for your organization, if you're here thinking about your workplace, or for yourself, where you sit in this kind of path towards grief resilience. So the up-down axes that you see there is about the support systems in the workplace, or maybe that you have around you if you're thinking on an individual basis. So if your support systems are weak in your workplace, you likely only have the things that are mandated by law, for example. Those are pretty weak support systems for the totality of the human experience. They cover off the basics, but they're not super robust, which is what we're aiming for, right? A robust support system would look like you have health and wellness programs, for example. You have access to wonderful therapists like the ones at Redbird. You have access to, you know, personal development programming, perhaps. You know, lots of places have mindfulness, have yoga, are learning about, you know, breathing techniques, all those kinds of things that really help us in our growth journey as individuals. So that's what a robust support system might look like. The axis going the opposite direction is about grief literacy. So if we're being honest, as a collective, most of us are down towards the weaker end of that. So when I'm talking about grief literacy, I'm talking about knowledge. I'm talking about comfort. You know, how comfortable are you saying something appropriate-ish to someone who's grieving, especially in those early days? Do you understand the timelines of grief and how long it could last? Are you aware of the symptoms? There's so many things we can learn about grief, and that's what we're starting to kind of assess on this continuum. If you have robust grief literacy, you're probably someone like me, or like many of you who've come to it through your own experience. It's such a taboo topic still that we're not learning proactively about grief very much. We're starting to take baby steps that direction. And that's really what I'm here to kind of accelerate that pace of us thinking ahead of time. You know, what can I do? I know this is going to happen. And especially with our aging population, we're all going to experience it more and more around our loved ones and the things that come as people age, right? With illness, with things like dementia, with the things that we need to deal with our elder population. So robust grief literacy is those things. You understand how it works. You understand that it's different for everyone. You have a sense of the symptoms, how they might show up. You might have a sense of what you could be looking for in people that might not even understand what they're experiencing is grief. So there's a whole continuum there. If you're in the square where you have, oh, that's one too many squares. Just pretend the grief crisis square is gold. If you're in that square, that's because you have weak support systems and weak grief literacy. So bare minimum support systems, bare minimum grief literacy. Often what that looks like is grief and loss are happening at work and nobody's talking about it. So people are left overwhelmed and trying to manage on their own when the loss is happening at work. It will look like there's no acknowledgement, right? The person who's lost a loved one has their maybe 3 days off, depending on their relationship as defined in whatever the agreement is, maybe 1 day off, maybe no days off. They've come back to work and you're hoping you never have to talk about it, okay? That's poor grief literacy and poor grief skills and support systems. Okay, one step, oh, we're going the wrong way. One step up from there is staff burnout. So staff burnout happens the most in organizations that have pretty robust grief literacy. Often the staff are really grief literate. They have great grief knowledge because they work in something like social services or healthcare, where they're dealing with customers, clients, patients, students that experience grief. So they know really well how to support others, but there's no support for them because the organizational support structures are weak. That's going to look like increased levels of people being on leave. It can look like people breaking down in meetings, right? I hear from people on the front lines of those kinds of organizations that they often find themselves, usually just before they take a leave, breaking down in meetings. They can't even get through a meeting because their system is so overwhelmed. They're so bombarded and burnt out that they can't self-regulate anymore. That obviously creates a vicious cycle because once you have one person go on leave, then you have other people carrying their workload. which increases their levels of burnout. And then you have another go on leave, and it becomes this vicious cycle that in many organizations, we really need to disrupt quite urgently. If you have weak grief literacy, but those amazing, robust support systems I was talking about, you can find yourself in a situation where you have staff withdrawal. So this is where the grievers are withdrawing because they look around them and they see amazing support systems for everyone else. There's perhaps a great return to work policy after injury, for example, or really amazing maternity and parental leave benefits. But they look around and they see there's nothing for them. There's nothing that helps them reintegrate into the workforce. And sometimes when they even express that they're grieving or they share that they're struggling, they get met with people with really poor grief literacy that shut down or say something harmful. And they learn quite quickly that they can't be their whole selves at work. And so then out of protection, especially in those early days where you're so tender and fragile, feeling, they have to withdraw. So that looks like presenteeism, for example. They're doing so many amazing studies around the costs of presenteeism when, the body is there, but the productivity is not, right? High levels of presenteeism. This is where we see people taking leaves, often not very well documented and not well costed, because organizations generally, when we're studying the cost of grief at work, the standard in the study seems to be always a disclaimer that the organizations they've surveyed don't track the cost of leaves very well, or the increases potentially in sick time. So that's staff withdrawal. If you have, you're in our target place, you have the robust support systems and the robust grief literacy, then you're approaching and encountering grief resilience. And that's the kinds of things that you all define so beautifully. We're having normal conversations about grief. We're acknowledging where it's happened in the workplace, right? We might open a conversation, if we've had a team create a project, they've launched the product, nothing happened. There's a whole bunch of feelings about that. What if the beginning of our debrief and, reconstruct meeting started with the leader saying, I'm having a whole bunch of feelings about that. And I just want to take a minute to say, I'm really mad. I'm disappointed. I'm sad. I'm feeling so frustrated because I thought we were on the right track, but we weren't. And I have a lot of feelings about that. I bet you do too. And I want you all to just feel confident knowing that I think you did an amazing job and you're still a valuable part of the team. It's that level of just normalizing that we're looking for. So just having that conversation that acknowledges that whether it's around patients, clients, your population that may be more at risk, whether it's something that happened at the workplace around a product or a safety situation, that we're talking about how grief is entangled in those experiences. So this is your chance to self-assess and pop it into the chat. When you look at those 4 quadrants and you think about your organization, where is your organization? So grief crisis, it's all bad, right? Staff burnout, high levels of people on leave, people really struggling to hold it together. They have great grief literacy, but no support. Staff withdrawal, where the people who are grieving just feel like they have to withdraw to protect. Or that place of grief resilience, where you're really having healthy conversations about this normal part of our lives. And most of you are off camera, so I can't see that you're typing. So I'm just going to assume you're typing, and we'll watch for your answers to pop up.
I would share from my past experience in community and social services where, staff burnout was substantive, and it was almost expected. People there's kind of a discussion of, but almost a joke about like what the attrition rate is per agency. Okay, we've got Chris talking about a hospital setting very similarly in that burnout quadrant. And you're kind of like, well, how long do people last here? Is this an agency where people spend 2 years or 5 years or 15 years? And if you find one where you last 15 years, it's really great.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, as you say, it's those social services and healthcare kind of settings where, it makes sense to us that grief happens there. And so then somehow we seem to think that people should just be able to manage it okay, which is such a weird way of thinking, because of course they can't unless there's really great support systems and ways to talk about it. And, maybe I was reading a great article about a healthcare, one of the hospital organizations in the States that launched a program to have serenity rooms. So when you need that break, you get to go to this serenity room. And I thought, oh, I love it. People are coming along, right? Like we do that in preschools. We have, for the preschoolers, they're all going to go to the quiet corner when they can't regulate. But when we can't regulate as adults in our workplace, like I'm not the only one that's been crying in the bathroom stall. And it doesn't need to be that way, right? We know better. We can do better. So yeah, thank you. Couple grief resilient, which is fabulous. So I'm super excited to see what your takeaways are at the end of tonight, if you're coming from that place already. Yeah, those health teams. And I'm not sure where the gap is. There's for sure a gap in the training. I hear that from people over and over again, that as an outsider, I assume that as a nurse or a social worker or a therapist, you've had really robust grief training, which doesn't seem to be the case, unfortunately. And then, yeah, that lack of emotional support at work. This grief is being created at work, but we're not supporting people there. It's just, I said that to a leader the other day that I was talking to, and I said, okay, so you're calling it trauma. That's fine. Trauma brings grief with it. So we'll agree that that's the term we're going to use. And it's being created at work and you're doing nothing about it. And they were like, yeah, like that was totally fine with them. And I thought, okay, this is a problem to me, but they seemed fine with it, but they can't fill their openings. They have open, massive vacancies, staffing crises, all those kinds of things. It's so frustrating. Yeah, Diana, absolutely. There's no support when you come back to work. And that's really, we all get to own that, right? Because we have this silence and we have poor skills, it's really awkward and uncomfortable, and people feel a lot of fear. So that's what this programming is all about, is how do we build that grief resilience? And in the conversations I've had with grievers, with HR professionals, with business leaders, I found 5 key things that you need to have in place. The first one we've kind of touched on already is that workplace culture piece. So is your workplace culture one where people can bring their whole selves to work, where it's okay on days where you're struggling to say, I'm struggling today and I need help, where that doesn't feel like there's going to be either retaliation or it's going to impact your advancement opportunities or it's going to be held against you in your performance review, right? That there's this expectation that's modeled by leadership, right? Because if the leaders are not modeling what they want, no one's going to be more vulnerable than their leader. No one's going to be more honest than their leader, right? So the leaders have to be modeling it. It has to be embedded in your culture that this really is a place where we care about each other, where our mental health is important, our psychological safety is important, our development as individuals is important. We have great health and wellness programs. Those are all parts of workplace culture, which is part of your employee experience, right? So we want to be taking a look at that, making sure that that's really supportive. And then those leaders, that leadership really has to have that compassion piece. So when I'm talking about compassion, I really see it as on a continuum with sympathy, which is where we feel sorry for people. Most of us are moving out of sympathy into empathy, where we have that concept of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, trying to understand what they're feeling. And then compassion is empathy in action. So that's where you really want to think in a bigger sense about what you can do to help. That's where we get to move into action. And the thing that's brilliant about compassion is it's empathy made visible. Empathy ends up being an internal thing, or it ends up being a thing that you maybe have in a one-on-one conversation with the person that needs support, but it's not visible really from the outside unless you're articulating it. But compassion is something that we can see because we see leaders stepping up. We see other staff stepping up to offer support, to say, as some of you said, what can I do for you today? What do you need right now, right? Stepping up to really provide support for people. One of the things that really helps us to move from sympathy to empathy to compassion and to have some of those awkward conversations is our own level of emotional intelligence. So we're going to do a bit of an exercise today that I really love as one that just helps us to really get to the place where we can name our emotions, where we can understand them better. For so many of us, we get caught up in kind of the mad, sad, glad level where, you know, we can't get past that. We feel those umbrella emotions. Anger is a great one. I feel so angry. Yes, and usually that's the umbrella. There's something else going on underneath that we may be worried about looking at. We may feel some fear around feeling our emotions. So this is a really gentle exercise that you can do. It's a conversation with yourself. It's really great, especially for those of us in North America who've been conditioned to be really great in our heads and not so great emotionally in our bodies. It's one I learned from my brilliant mentor, Dr. Claire Zammit. She's the founder of the Institute for Women-Centered Coaching, Training, and Leadership. And she focuses on 3 relationships: our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with life itself, and our relationship with others. And this is one of her exercises from building your relationship with yourself. It's one that I do regularly because we know if we can name that emotion, even just naming it starts to move it. So that's our goal, right? Is to keep the emotions moving and allow them to go around and move out of our bodies. So normally I would encourage people to find a feelings wheel, which you've probably seen. There's tons of them online. They're all great. They're really hard to read when I'm sharing a slide. So I've pulled up this really great graphic from Suzanne David. She's a psychologist whose expertise is around emotional intelligence and now emotional agility, which is, to me, the most brilliant next step in our emotional intelligence journey. I just love her writing about emotional agility. So this is just a way that you can use this tool as we're doing the exercise to just get down to the nuance of the emotions. So the exercise is going to go something like this. You're just having a conversation with yourself. It's all internal. You're going to ask yourself, how are you feeling? So something like this: Suzanne, how are you feeling? And then you just reflect back. Oh, sorry, you have to answer first. Suzanne, how are you feeling? And then you answer next. Yes, thanks, Barb, for being on top of the chat for me. Emotional agility. How are you feeling? I'm feeling excited. And then you just reflect back. I hear that you're feeling excited. Okay, no commentary, no judgment. It's just a pure reflection back. You're going to do that 3 times. How are you feeling? I'm feeling whatever it is, and reflect back. I hear that you're feeling. Then there's a 4th question, and I'm going to guide you through this whole exercise. So don't be panicking that you need to remember the steps. I'm going to lead you through it as we go. This is just the outline. The 4th question is, what do you need? Same rhythm. What do you need? Feel into, name that need, and reflect it back. Okay. We want to do this from our most resourced state. So you can close your eyes if you're comfortable doing it that way. You can keep them open so you can see the graphic on the screen, and just really taking a couple of deep breaths, really connecting with the part of yourself that's the most resilient, the most amazing, the most able to be resourced. Taking a couple deep breaths. And then you're going to ask yourself the first time, how are you feeling? And then answer and reflect back. And a second time, even more nuanced. How are you feeling? And answer and reflect back. Third time, how are you feeling? And answer and reflect back. And then your 4th question is, what do you need? And answer and reflect back. And then I want you to just feel into that need. Feel into whether it's something you can provide yourself, who in your circle you might reach out to, understanding that we are far more resourced than we can imagine, and that most of the time, everything we need is within reach. taking a few deep breaths, just coming back into our meeting space. And I'd love to get a little bit of feedback. Just a yes or no in the chat is great. Did you learn something new about yourself? Were you able to go a little deeper than you might have without the 3 questions? Yeah, and if you want to take a screenshot or a picture of that graphic, you're welcome to, and it'll be in the recording that Redbird will have. I love her graphics because they're just a little bit quirky, but they also always have everything we need in them. They're wonderful. Yeah, Barbara, exactly. Isn't that so interesting? We think the first one we feel is the one, but really there's a second and a third. And, the more nuanced we can be when we're naming them, the better we can be at shifting them, right? And letting them move. So it's so, so powerful. And it's just an exercise you're going to do with yourself. So you don't have to share it with anyone. I'm not advocating that we're all at work, booing and hooing, though sometimes we can, that's fine. But it's just a way to be connected with ourselves and understanding more what's going on for us. Because if we have that ability, then we're better at holding space for others. Yeah, and that broader range, right? That broader sense of what's really going on here? What is that really? And especially in grief, where so often the emotions just feel like a big overwhelming tsunami. That's not helpful. We need to understand, like, is this sadness? Is this despair? Is this heartache? Is this hopefulness, even though it feels overwhelming, right? What's the nuance of what's going on? So that helps leaders connect with themselves. And that helps all of us, right? It's an exercise you can do anytime, just quietly with yourself. The third key is that grief literacy piece. So how is the skill set of the organization top to bottom? Normally what I see in organizations is it wildly varies. We have people with really great grief literacy. Usually they've earned from their personal experience. We have people with really limited grief literacy because they still carry a lot of fear and they don't want to do any harm. And they have no space to talk about it. So we want to address that feeling that we don't know how to talk about it and we don't know what to say, what to do. We don't really know at all. And so we end up doing nothing and we end up all isolated. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on grief literacy in the next graphic, but that's what we're looking at when we're doing sort of this assessment of where the gaps are. The fourth key is that customized structure. So some of you mentioned that when you came back to work, there really was no support at all. That's very typical. That's super normal. So we want to normalize that we're all in this mess together, right? Our collective, silence and fear around grief and conversations about it mean that we don't have the skills, but we can learn skills, we can practice and get better. So, and when we create these customized structures, what it really helps with also is a framework for those conversations that feel awkward. So if you've developed that customized structure, you would have a menu, for example, that would have things on it that would support a griever and the symptoms that they experience when they come back to work. So you've thought about things like brain fog. How can we support people with brain fog? Well, we can have shared calendars. We can have shared Google documents that set out deliverables and when they're due, for example. We can look really carefully at our people who are in safety sensitive situations where we know that distraction is not good for safety. So how do we support them when they're newly grieving and really easily distracted? All of those kinds of things. We look at the symptoms, how we can mitigate for those symptoms so that the griever is at work feeling supported, feeling like they can still be successful, and feeling like they're really cared for, right? We want to up that level of people feeling like they're cared for. There was a great study done in the UK where they looked at all kinds of different aspects of grief in the workplace. And one of the things they found was about 58% of grievers had felt pressured to return to work before they felt ready. So some of that pressure may have come from the workplace. Some of that may have been economic pressure, right? Most of us can't afford to take a long unpaid leave. But if we can have those structures in place, we can help those people who maybe don't feel fully ready to be at work, still be there, still be successful, and be acknowledged as really important parts of our team. The fifth key is really developing a supportive environment. So that's an aspect of workplace culture that really sets up an understanding that there's an ebb and flow to support. So that sometimes you're the recipient of support, sometimes you're the giver of support, our capacities ebb and flow. And well, yes, we all have deliverables, we all have things we need to get done. Sometimes we need help, sometimes we don't, sometimes we can give extra. All of that ebbs and flows and really creates an ecosystem where there's broader responsibility, there's broader buy-in, and people really are able to let go of that sense that no matter what, they have to show up, get it done, and push through, because we know that that's not healthy, right? That's where we end up in burnout or in withdrawal, because we just can't any longer do what is being asked of us. And it's not healthy for any of us. The leadership right on, from the C-suite to the frontline, entry-level worker, it's not good for anybody, and it's not good for the organization. So how do we disrupt that? So when you look at those 5 keys, I'd love for you to share where you think your organization is really strong and where you think the gap might be. And you can just pop it in the chat. And if you're looking at it from your own personal experience, if you're not here sort of thinking about a workplace, where do you look and think, oh, I could really up my level here, but I'm really great at this other thing. So for you as a person, for your organization, if that's the hat you're wearing tonight, either of those is great. Gary, is that the gap or that's the strength, compassionate leadership? Excellent. Oh, yay. I love compassionate leaders. That's okay. It's all good. Yeah, we need help in them all. Yeah. That's not unusual either. Unfortunately, at this point, that's not unusual. So yes, no, it's a no blame, no shame discovery, right? We just need the knowledge and the expertise. Great. So strong grief literacy, right? That's likely because of the structure of because of the business model, and then a lack of structure to support. Yeah, and that's very reasonable, Barbara, right? It's a newer company. So, you're building supports as you need them. You're building these structures as they come to mind. And this is now one that's come to mind. Here I am. So what I've discovered is there's a 4-step process. Yeah, Diana, that's right. Really great at compassion, but not so good at verbalizing it. And that's really normal. And that's why I love thinking about compassion as that place where we can put empathy into action. Because we can do action. We're pretty good at that, right? And that's also a way that we can respond that feels a little bit more comfortable, right? If we're thinking about it as, okay, I have this deep empathy for this person. I have a sense of what they're going through because I'm trying to understand, and I'm having conversations with them, even if they feel awkward. And how do I put that into action? How do I put my compassion to work and really show up in a big way to support them? So 4 steps to get us from where we are to where we need to go to that grief resilience place. The first thing we need to do is a workplace grief assessment. So this is a process where you really look at your business model, because it's going to be different for every business, and think about where grief comes from and shows up at work. So generally, there's 3 different places. People bring grief from their personal life. So that can be the loss of a loved one. It could be the loss of a relationship. It could be a collective grief. There's something going on in the community that's really upsetting. It could be something they've heard on the way to work, right? That they're listening to the news on the radio and something's happened somewhere that activates their grief. So they're bringing grief from their personal life, from losses big and small. Often grief happens at work. So no matter what your business model, we can usually find some grief that happens at work. So obviously in healthcare, social services, we've talked about that already. We all can understand where those griefs could happen. When we're looking at a product-based business, right? What about when the product doesn't work? When we look at a business that's really based on quarter over quarter earnings, what about when the earnings fall off? What about, there's so many places, the average business restructures every 2 to 3 years. And every time you have a restructure, you're creating grief. And we understand that for the people who've lost their jobs, but we forget to think about it for the people that are left behind, who maybe have lost a close colleague or a lunchroom, coffee room friend. They've lost some of their sense of stability because maybe they think the people that got let go were at least as good as, if not better than them. So now they're feeling some instability. They might have survivor's grief, survivor's remorse, right? Survivor's guilt, and be really feeling like I'm here. And what does that mean? And how do I go on from here? And they may be on a new team. There's so many things that come with restructures, and we're not addressing that in the workplace. The second step is that enhanced leadership compassion. We've talked about that, getting in touch with our own emotions, building through emotional intelligence to this idea of emotional agility, where we really can feel them and shift them and be really agile as we move through them with a little bit of grace. How do we take that sense of empathy and move it into compassion? How do we really, as the leaders, model what we want from our employees, what we want for our employees, and really start to shift that workplace culture to another level? Grief skill building is where we spend the bulk of the time, because that's the bulk of the need, right? We've identified that a little bit tonight. That same study out of the UK, they found over 30% of the managers wished they had more training about grief, because they understand, especially in that middle management place where you have a lot of direct reports, they especially understand that they need to be able to support people. And because they're part of our culture, they don't know how. So we're going to do a little bit of grief skill building tonight, just so you have some skills you can leave with and maybe some different ways to think about it. So I'm going to address the 3 questions I get the most often, which are, what can I say? What can I do? And how does this show up at work? What can I do at work? So when we're talking about what to say, most of us have that instinct that the things we've heard in the past that maybe people have said, I jokingly say, if you heard your Aunt Mildred say it to your mother at your grandmother's funeral, you should probably never say it, right? All those old cliches and platitudes, we know on some level that they no longer serve. Some of them are neutral. Some of them are actively harmful. Most of them don't create connection, which is ultimately what we're hoping will happen. They don't leave the person feeling more supported. So what we want to say is something really open, honest, and from our heart. I wish I could come up with the one size fits all. Here's what you should say to every grieving person. That's not how grief works. So it's not how what we say works either. But what you want to do is say something really genuine from the heart that's meaningful for your relationship with that person and probably the loss that they've experienced. So when I do a longer workshop, and we're going to talk about the longer workshop later in the presentation, we do a brainstorming session and a little bit of a journaling session about what you could say. And the things people come up with are so beautiful. And I'll say from my experience, for my loss, the most wonderful things people said often started with, I have no idea what to say. There is no perfect thing to say. So saying what's true for you, I don't know what to say. There's no words that can express what I'm feeling because I feel so overwhelmed. And I just think what's happened is so horrible. And I'm here for you and I care about you. And, I'll help you figure it out. Maybe that's what you want to say. Whatever it is something that comes from your heart, is open and generous, and offers the support emotionally that you want to offer. When it comes to what can I do, the exact opposite is true. So I think it was Diana that was saying she had heard on a podcast to ask something like, what can I do for you right now? And that's exactly on the right track. We want to make a very specific offer. All of those wonderful open-ended offers, call if you need anything, whatever you need, I'm here for you. Let me know if there's anything I can do for you. We say those over and over again with the best of intentions and really genuinely wanting to help. But for a griever who is just trying to breathe, you can't conceptualize what you might need. So a really specific offer is super helpful. So I'm going grocery shopping today. Can you go open your fridge and tell me what's missing? And I'll bring it to you this afternoon. That's a very specific offer. It's garbage day. Can I grab your cans and take them to the curb for you? A very specific offer. We have a big presentation due tomorrow. Would it be helpful if I touched base with you in the morning and we set up a schedule for the day so that we make sure we're ready to go on time? Very specific offer. And then the griever gets to say yes or no. It's always griever centered. We never want to impose what we think the person might need upon them. We want it to be griever centered. They get to decide if it's a yes or no. And if it's a no, my suggestion always is that you offer again sometime down the road, something slightly different or the same thing. They might need it that day. But just understanding that yes, no answers are really great for grievers. So if it's a question where the answer is yes or no, do you need milk or bread? Oh, I'm not sure. Let me go look. We can do that, right? What do you need? Anything, I'll do it. We can't fathom that. It's too complicated. The other thing that people ask about all the time is, and that's, the foundation of this workshop, what about at work? What could we do to practically support people at work in a general kind of way? So I'm not talking now necessarily about support structures within the work that they're doing. We'll talk about that in a second. But anything practical that you're doing for yourself, the griever needs to, and they may be struggling with it. So one of the ideas that came up in a workshop the other day was to do like a lunch club. So if the griever is really struggling feeding themselves, which is a very normal symptom, especially in those early days, the idea for me of finding a recipe, getting the ingredients, prepping the ingredients, cooking the ingredients in order to be able to get to eat at some point was just overwhelming. My daughter tells a hilarious story of us deciding we should be able to feed ourselves, that we felt strong enough that day to take it on. And we decided to make a grilled cheese sandwich. And it took us 45 minutes. So, I'm here to advocate for the complexity of making a grilled cheese sandwich. I know it's really not that complicated, but when you're in those early days of grief, everything feels complicated. So that person might be really struggling to feed themselves. So what if on Mondays, one person provided their lunch and Tuesdays it was a different person? That's a really easy thing to do to help people. What if you carpooled? What if you had a system where it was just acknowledged, we can't have a serenity lounge, but we could say, you know what? If I'm not at my desk, I've probably just needed to go for a walk and I've got my phone with me and you can message anytime, right? What if we create a norm where when we're feeling overwhelmed, the expectation is we go off and we deal with it? Often when I'm talking to business leaders, they'll say something like, well, but I don't want there to be a whole lot of drama at work. The drama happens when we're not allowed to go and take care of ourselves. The drama happens when, and again, I bet I'm not the only person that's done this, when we're crying at our desk. And then everybody wants to know what's going on. So now you're surrounded by people while you're crying at your desk. And now the drama is big. Whereas if the understanding was, I'm likely to feel overwhelmed at some points this week, right? I know this coming week, there will be times I feel overwhelmed. We're coming up to the anniversary of Ben's death. That's a norm for me right now. There will be moments I feel overwhelmed. If I can share that at work and say, I'm just going to need at some points to go for a wander, I won't be long and I'll come back, and I don't need anybody to come and help me. I'll be fine. We're normalizing a bunch of things. We're normalizing that most of us can take care of ourselves most of the time, that sometimes we need support, and if we do, we can ask for it. And that the expectation is our whole selves are at work. I can't pretend to leave my grief at the door. For me, that was impossible. So my wonderful employer, I had a really great and immediate supervisor, and the rest of the food chain was absolutely useless and actually did harm. So I just focused on him. But it was impossible for me to leave my grief at the door. After the 3 days leave, you're not leaving your grief at the door. It's there. So how can we support each other? How can we create a system where having those experiences at work is normalized and there's healthy ways to manage it? The other thing about grief skill building is it comes out of conversations. So, if I'm working with an organization, I'm there to facilitate those conversations. And inevitably, there are grief experts in that workplace. I know, Barbara, you found it with some of the staff that you've brought on recently, which was the impetus for this wonderful series of workshops to start, right? You had someone come on who had that expertise and was passionate about sharing it. Most organizations have people there that have that expertise. Some may be willing to share, some might not. That's totally fine. But for the ones who do want to share, there's ways that we can leverage that and have them then be key people that you can access as a resource, where we're empowering them to share their story, their knowledge, their experience, instead of them feeling in that staff withdrawal quadrant, right? We want them to feel engaged and able to share as much as they want, however safe they feel, right? It always has to be optional. It always has to just be encouraged, but not demanded, because otherwise we're really, really taking psychological safety way back. So always griever-centered, always optional. But there's lots of ways that we can access knowledge and share knowledge and start to normalize those conversations. Then we spend a big chunk of time designing that ongoing support. So what does the structure look like that people come back to work to? So that's the idea of accommodations, like you would have for someone who is coming back after injury. So how do we keep people who are in safety sensitive positions safe? How do we create support where the person can come to their supervisor and say, oh, I've suffered a loss. There shouldn't be a requirement to name it. I've suffered a loss. I'm going to really need some support for the next week. Can we look at that policy together and just see if there's anything on that list that I could use, right? Flex time is a wonderful support for positions where you can offer that. Not every position is going to be able to have that. Hybrid working from home some of the time, also fabulous if you can offer that. How could you offer, technology puts us in a position where so much of what we could offer is covered in technology, right? Shared calendars, breakdowns of projects, when are the deliverables due, all of that kind of stuff. When is the meeting with reminders? And if everyone has had a hand in setting those up and everybody knows how they're going to work, one of the ripples of that is it frees up everybody's mental capacity from having to remember all of those things or take care of them themselves, which puts everyone in a position of being more creative, more innovative, which is really what we've hired our people to be, right? We've hired them for their creativity. Most of the time, we've not hired them to be a cog in the machine. We want their ideas. We want their understanding of the job. We want their expertise. So if we set it up so that they're able to do that when they're thriving and when they're struggling, then we get that ripple effect that really shows people that we really deeply care about them and them being their whole selves at work. So when you look at those 4 steps, here's another question for you. Kathleen's going to put it in the chat. We've talked a little bit about grief skills. We've talked throughout the presentation a little bit about some of the symptoms. When you think about that ongoing support piece, if you have a question, because you think, oh, what about this? Would that work? I'm happy for you to pop that question in the chat. And if you have an idea, I'd love for you to pop that in the chat. Like, what's one thing you could implement tomorrow? What day is it today? Wednesday. Yes. So when you go back to work tomorrow, that you could do then, and you could say, I was on this workshop last night. We were talking about grief. What does everybody think about doing X, Y, or Z, whatever it is? I'd love your ideas. This is another place where we get to learn from each other. We get to cross-pollinate our experiences and really start to build this robust system of understanding.
I would like to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
For me, it would be like maybe the employer have maybe 3 or 4 people that are very good in working with grief and then support that individual, because not everybody want people to know their business, to have that little privacy where the person can, talk about their ongoing bereavement, and also be able to know that whatever I'm telling these people here stays there, because it might be something much deeper that they don't want any other person to know. But if they are given that opportunity, like, whatever you shared here, stay here. We're here for you to process your grief. The person might open up more. And I want to thank the woman that talked about having a grief over a loss of a relationship. That's a huge thing right now that I also see in my practice. And not a lot of people want to talk about it because they feel like they're being judged, or ashamed, like, oh, my relationship broke up, or maybe it's a pattern. What am I doing wrong? Things like that. So they might need somebody to actually talk to them in a private way so that they can open up about, oh, this is what I'm, because to every grief, if it's relationship, we both contribute something. And it depends on the amount of contribution. So maybe I'm the one that's doing something wrong. Maybe I'm a forgiver. Maybe, things like that. And the person took advantages of me. Maybe it's something I want to discuss in a closed door versus I want to share that with everybody. So having a couple of people that are very good in understanding the grieving process will be very, will be something that they should incorporate versus an open group where, people will be limited to share their experiences.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Some organizations choose to do that. Most don't, for a couple of reasons. There's a lot of sense among employers that they don't want to be the therapist, right? They don't have the qualifications, they don't have the experience or expertise. They certainly could have someone on staff. And in places that do, what's interesting is I hear from the people who might access those resources. So I'm thinking about a particular social service agency where I am, where I've done some conversations with their leadership and with their frontline people. And what I hear from them is they don't want to use the in-house resource because they don't trust the confidentiality piece. So it's really tricky to provide that in-house, that kind of emotional support piece where people want help processing and want help really dealing with the emotional part. I think the healthiest thing for employers to do in that sphere is have it as a benefit, right? Have either a really great employee assistance program, which in my experience, they're not super strong. I know there are strong ones. That's not been my experience. But if you can have access to licensed therapists or grief counselors, grief coaches, people with some expertise around grief that are outside the workplace, that often is the more beneficial option, just because I think there is that sense among people that they don't trust the confidentiality piece. And that, I think most of us would feel uncomfortable actually processing our emotions at work. We're going to have them. We're going to need to self-regulate with them. We're going to need practical support. But I don't know that I want to be going to someone whose office is down the hall that I'm then going to be in a collegial relationship with and sharing like the vastness of my emotional experience. Because grief does bring up a whole bunch of other stuff, as you've articulated really so well. I think there's some hesitancy on both ends to provide that in the building. But for sure, there should be access to it somehow, whether you're choosing to do it in-house or you're, have it as a benefit where there's an amount you can spend, or access to an EAP that's funded by the employer. For sure, a lot of people need help processing their grief. And that is because of that shame and blame piece that you were talking about. Grief is this weird space where we both don't want to talk about it and we want to have a whole bunch of judgment about it, which to me is the weirdest structure ever. So we're silent, we have limited knowledge and experience and expertise, but we want to hold a lot of judgment about how you're doing it, and usually about how you're doing it wrong, even though the person who's making the judgment has never experienced what you're experiencing. So it's really tricky. I love that perspective, and there really is a need for people to get support with that emotional piece. It's really easy to get caught up there and not be able to find your way forward. And I think employers are best off offering that as something that happens outside the workplace in this moment, right? If we could all build our grief literacy, our understanding of how it works, have it be a more normal part of our conversation, there would be less hesitancy, I believe. But right now, people are still pretty scared to admit what's going on, unless they've got some really great modeling from leadership around vulnerability and honesty and dealing with emotions. I think it's a pretty big ask for people to go to a coworker, even if they're a coworker with expertise. It's pretty tough.
I also want to suggest, you talked about the benefit. They can also include that in the benefit separately from the regular $300 that some organization give for psychotherapy. They could just have that piece, like, grief benefit, maybe allocate a certain amount of money into that as well, so that when you're going through your process, it would not be added to the psychotherapy, because not all psychotherapists, are knowledgeable about grief. So they could just have a separate benefit for just grief.
Absolutely. That would find someone who has that grief knowledge and that grief training for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
And really, we all know anyone who's ever tried to access that $300, it's just nowhere near enough. The $300 is, anyway, I'll leave that soapbox for a different day. Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I was just, as the owner of Redbird Therapy and as an association, clinic where we do a lot of this work, we have built relationships, particularly with smaller and medium-sized companies where they may not be able to afford a very large health benefits package, but they do want to ensure that their employees have access to some mental health services or some grief support. And that's looked different in different environments. So I think we can think about, like, the large companies are going to have those big packages with very large companies already established. But the smaller companies, they're like, okay, we're going to do 12 sessions and the billing is all anonymous. People, the owners of these companies have sat down and said, look, at your mental well-being is essential for us to function well. And this is what we're doing. Here's this company that we are partnered with where you have a selection of therapists to pick from, and here's how much time you get. Here's how the program works. And my experience with that has been, it's really allowed their employees to kind of bring the best that they can back to the work environment, having a safe and private and sort of sacred space to do that work. We've also been asking if there's been a significant loss, for example, an environment where there was a death by suicide and nobody knew anything about suicide. It was a really terrifying experience for this whole collective. And so what was that like? They offered a group open conversation where I led that experience and provided a little bit of teaching, provided a little bit of space for folks to talk about their feelings, talked about what other resources might be useful, and thought through some of what this kind of bereavement might require of them. Right. So certainly I know that if you're in a smaller organization, if you're in a smaller company, that thinking through a formal policy of benefit support can really be good, and finding a company that you trust,
Yeah, I love that. I mean, 12 sessions is so much better than the $300. And so much better than, the whole EAP idea, and that's often when companies come to me, is because they've had someone have a significant loss or they've had a loss in the workplace. And they think, well, 3 days in the EAP isn't enough. Like, there's got to be more that we can do. And of course there is, right? We're talking about, the structures you can put in place in the workplace. And Barbara's talking about, that place that people need where they're safe. They know the anonymity is there, the confidentiality is there, the expertise of the person they're speaking to is there. And there's a real level of comfort with that. And I love that employers of, of small, medium companies, I think often see the costs of poor mental wellness sooner than the bigger companies do, because your team so much better and you're so much more interconnected from top to bottom.
And if you have a team of 10 people and one person's out, that's 1/10 of your employee base. You're in trouble.
Yeah. And I think that's, I'm so encouraged to hear that there really are companies that are responding with this robust support. Like 12 sessions is pretty, you can do a lot of work in 12 sessions. That's fabulous. That's 3 months of support, or you spread it out, you've got 6 months of support. That's really getting people through the worst of it. Regardless of what, sort of inciting incident is, whether it's grief or loss, or it's, something else to do with your mental wellness. That's wonderful. That's so encouraging to me. I just love it. All right. What we're trying to create, why we would do all of this, is because we want that win-win environment. So we want optimal engagement. We want our employees to feel valued. We want them to feel engaged in the company, like they're working for somewhere with integrity. They understand the mission and they're on board. All those engagement pieces we know start to falter when people don't feel seen, heard, and valued, and when they don't feel like they can bring their whole selves to work. And particularly the younger generations are really modeling for us oldsters, this new expectation about how you should be treated, how you should be listened to, how you should be valued. I'm really so grateful for how they're forcing change in the workplace by just putting their foot down and saying no. You know, they will quit and they will find a new job relatively quickly. And they're totally okay with that. That whole sense of, well, but I signed a contract and I have to stay, and that weird loyalty that I was enculturated into, they don't feel that. So we really need to be taking good care and feeling much more responsive and responsible for that optimal engagement piece. The other piece that happens for a lot of companies is they're really striving towards that employer of choice status. So whether that's something specific to your industry or a more general one that's through, you know, there's a million organizations doing employer of choice, depending on where you are and what your connections are. We really need that status to be able to put ourselves at the forefront, trying to find the skilled, qualified applicants that we need. We've got this staffing shortage. It's happening globally, almost in every industry. It seems like the reading that I'm doing indicates that anyway. And really what I hear from HR professionals when I'm on forums with them is they can't get qualified candidates. They get tons of applications and no one's qualified. The flip side is they're not getting enough. They have too many openings. There's too many openings for the people that have the qualifications, and people are struggling to find places that are a good fit. And people care about it being more than just a job. So that employer of choice status and this ability to say, wow, we care so much about our employers. We're actually looking at grief. We understand coming out of our experience the last 3.5 years, everyone is experiencing grief. And we take that really seriously because it impacts our team members. It impacts our ability to be fully functioning and be creative and innovative. And we really care about that. This is one way that you can put yourself sort of at the forefront of that conversation. And of course, whether you're a for-profit or not for-profit, that profitability piece, that money coming in, whether it's from grants, from profit, we need that in order to provide the programming for our staff, in order to continue building our business, in order to have team members, right? If we're not staying profitable, we're not staying in business. When people are cared for, they are more productive. When people feel valued, they are more productive. We know that replacing someone who's chosen to leave because they were under-supported costs about 20% of that person's salary. That's a lot of money. We need to be taking better care of our people, even if our focus is profitability. The care of the people impacts the profitability. It's no longer good enough to just say it's profit over people. It's not sustainable any longer. We've all changed our relationship with work and had a bit of an awakening about what we're prepared to put up with. Yeah, Diana, absolutely. Acknowledging people's lived experience, so important. It's just a critical piece of this whole puzzle. When we get all of those three things working together in that sort of holistic way, we end up with that grief resilience. So we're starting to normalize grief as a part of our lives. It's a part of the human experience. We are all going to experience it at some point or other. It's something that we need to be prepared to deal with in the workplace. And when we look at, the 5 keys, the 4 steps, really building those grief skills and that understanding, it really helps us address all of these facets of a thriving and healthy workplace. So if anything that we've talked about today is of interest to you, if you think, oh my gosh, we've just barely scratched the surface, I know, because we only have 90 minutes and we've only got 40 of them left. And I want to make sure we leave time for conversation and for, really being responsive to the needs that you've brought. Today, you decided to come probably because there was something going on that you wanted help addressing. So I want to make sure we have time for that at the end. I do offer a half-day workshop. And in it, we just really go deeply into those 4 steps to building that grief resilience piece. So there's some key things that you're going to learn and take away. You're going to complete that workplace grief assessment. So we'll really look at your workplace, your business. How does grief show up there? Like what kinds of things are people, what's the demographic of your team, for example? If you have people who are in that sandwich generation, right, that are managing elder care and kids, they have a whole set of griefs that can come with that we can look at. Okay, what's your demographic of your staff? What's your business model? Where is grief embedded in the business model that we need to be talking about? What's your client group? Who are your customers? Are they patients that maybe have higher risk factors? Are they students that are, I think about universities and the poor mental wellness that happens at universities because kids are thrown into a new situation. They feel anonymous. They're overwhelmed by decisions, right? All kinds of things. Like, what's your front line? Who's your client, customer, and what do they need? And how do we make sure your staff are supported so you have high customer satisfaction and high staff satisfaction, and you're helping people who are bringing grief from their personal life? So we're going to do that assessment. We're going to really dig into those common symptoms. There's about 10 really common symptoms that happen to most people at some point, and look at how those then operationalize in the workplace. So what does brain fog, for example, look like in the workplace? It doesn't look like it took me 45 minutes to make a grilled cheese sandwich. It's going to look like something different. And so we can look at the different roles in your organization and really start to break down, how might those symptoms show up, and how can you use your understanding of those symptoms to maybe even be opening conversations with people who might not even understand that what they're experiencing is grief, right? I had a great conversation the other day on a workshop about, it was a company where the person had worked there for 20 years and they had never talked about grief in the workplace, but they talk about stress all the time, right? So what is that difference between stress and grief? And what is, she was saying their new buzzword is they're supposed to befriend change. And I said, well, how do you befriend change if we're not acknowledging that change brings loss and grief? And she said, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think there might be a gap there. I was like, yeah, you can't, we're all talking so much about change management and befriending change. I thought that was the buzziest version of buzzness that I'd ever heard recently. Okay, we're going to befriend change, but not talk about grief. We all have these gaps because we carry fear. So how can we look at, is it stress? Because stress is a real thing too. I'm not trying to minimize that that's the thing, but so much of it's coming from this unprocessed grief that we're all carrying, especially out of the last 3.5 years, where we lost all kinds of things and now find ourselves in this new normal, which mostly seems to be about disruption and uncertainty and historic levels of environmental unrest and social unrest and a lot of lashing out from fear. So, how do we assess where is this coming from, and do our grief skills help us here? All of this is intended to help you build some confidence around being able to address grief. That thing that holds us in isolation when grief happens is our lack of knowledge, and our lack of knowledge leads to the fear, and the fear leads us to being stuck. And then what happens is time passes, it gets more awkward to say something or do something or offer support. And then we've not said anything. And now we're all isolated, right? The griever doesn't really understand what's happening to them. The support person doesn't understand how to support them. And instead of this really rich environment to build connection, we're building isolation. So how do we break that down and build some confidence that, yes, we are going to be brilliant and imperfect. We're learning. Anytime we're learning, the first try isn't the best. That's why I think it's so important. And I start with that definition of grief, because if we can start learning how to support people with the smaller griefs, right, then we have some skills at hand when the bigger ones come. Someone like me who's a grieving mom, grieving out loud, I'm not a good first assignment. But if you have some confidence, a little bit of skills in your toolbox, and you can do it messily and imperfectly, and that's okay, then we're able to really start to create that positive ripple where we're able to support each other. And we're going to take a look at that customized structure and what that could look like in your workplace. So we're going to start to build that menu, for example. We're going to start to look at, what could a grief policy look like? Where would that live in your organization, right? Where do we put this documentation so that the griever can come to the supervisor and say, oh, that policy that we were talking about the other day, yeah, could we look at that together? And then there's a framework for the conversation. So the griever feels more comfortable. They know there's something for them to access. And the supervisor, the manager, the team lead feels more comfortable because they have a framework for their conversation. They know ahead of time what they can offer. They're not trying to make it up on an ad hoc basis. The other thing that happens when we start to have these conversations is we start to level the playing field. What I hear over and over again, especially in those high staff burnout places, is that there's teams that are really great at dealing with these issues and teams that are not so great. And the burnout tends to follow the teams that are not so great. And then those teams get reputations, and the frontline people can tell me immediately, oh, I would work on that team in a heartbeat and I will never go work there. You have a problem as an employer if that's your situation. So we want to level that playing field, right? We want to move everyone's base knowledge up and really start to find those, life experience earned experts that are willing to share and be key people that we can access and can really help us to build these policies and procedures and protocols so that there's a structure for when people want to come and access them or need to come and access them. This is a workshop that I do regularly. The next one is October 20th. It's a Friday from 9 till noon Pacific time, because I'm in Vancouver. So it starts at your lunchtime if you're in Ontario. It kind of covers everybody except the Australia, Asia time zone. They're sleeping, but everybody else can make it at that time. So that's why I do it at that time. It's available on my website. Kathleen's put the link in there. If you click on that link, you'll see that the regular price for that half-day workshop is $797. Because we're on this amazing Redbird experience, I have let me go back one. I have a discount code for you to use that'll bring the price down by half. So we're going to bring it down to $397 for everyone who was here today or is watching the recording. And you're going to use that code Redbird. So when there's a spot for the discount code, you're just going to put Redbird and that will drop the price by about half. Because it's so important to me that people like you who are committed to coming in their evening to be part of this conversation really have access to a deeper level of understanding and a deeper place of conversation and skill building, because it's much more interactive than this has been so far. So now we're going to go to the interactive part, but I do want to leave this slide up for the folks watching the recording, because you're not going to have access to the chat where my lovely assistant Kathleen has put all the links for you, and you can save the chat and then have them all. I'm so technologically proud of myself. I made a QR code today. I'm so happy. So for those of you watching the recording, or those of you that just have your phone and you want to just go to it that way, you can use the QR code. I'll leave it on the screen just for a minute so that you have it and be able to just use your camera. For those of you not familiar with QR codes, you just hold your camera up to it. It will make a little frame around the black and white gobbledygook and give you a link you can tap on, and that'll take you right to the registration page to the store on my website. That is all of the slides today. The other thing that Kathleen has so nicely put in the chat for us is all of the ways that you can contact me. So if you're not quite ready for the workshop, but you have questions, or you want to go look at my website and see what else is there, that's where you can find me. There's my, I don't need to say them. You can all read them. Suzanne@livedexperience.com. I'm going to say them anyway, is my email. And I'm happy to be a resource for you to answer any questions that you have. It's a big part of what I do, is just help people out. And my website has all kinds of free resources on it. So if you go to that website, there's an ebook that you can use that covers a lot of what we've covered today. Just a really basic introduction to some of the ways grief might show up, some of the symptoms to watch for, and how they might be operationalized in the workplace. And that's all there. So that is the end of my formal presentation. I know we've had a big download of information. And if your mind is spinning a little bit, that's okay. I purposefully today wanted to leave a lot of time for us to be more interactive, because you made it very clear at the beginning that you came with some really specific questions and some really specific perspectives. So I'd love for you to come on camera. I'd love for you to just raise your hand if you have a question about anything we've talked about today or about the workshop itself. I have a high level of grief expertise, hard earned, and Barbara's here as well to be responsive to your needs. We're here to serve. So I do really want to open up the floor to a conversation